Good evening. This is Jack, KW5A, and Wayne and the other net managers have kindly asked me if I would speak for a few minutes on Marconi's activities at Signal Hill in 1901. Because I'll concentrate on that period, I'll just do a little bit on the history of how he got to be where he was, and answer one of the questions which students in my class every semester used to ask me, which is, how do you pronounce this guy's first name? His name in Bologna, in the north of Italy, is pronounced Guglielmo. And born in 1874, his dad, Giuseppe, was a member of the aristocratic class of Italy, and his mom, Annie Jameson, was from County Wexford in Ireland. And if the name Jameson sounds familiar, it's because she was a granddaughter of John Jameson, who found the famous distillery in Dublin, Ireland. He was privately educated, as young men of substance were often in those days, and he was fortunate that two of his major tutors had a keen interest in electronics and communications as well. He also was a consummate businessman as he grew up, and the name Guillermo really translates as William, or colloquially as Bill, and he certainly brings to mind another Bill, and that's Bill Gates. He really was not particularly interested in the science of communications unless it showed a potential for making money, in which case he was very interested. And so some of the decisions that he made and some of the things we're going to be talking about are based upon that particular interest. He did some early research on the works of Heinrich Hertz in Germany, and he based most of his systems on spark gap technology, and he really continued with that until the beginning of the First World War. He was a super salesman, and he was really uninterested in the inquiry itself unless there were dollar signs as the obvious outcome. He really was content to leave the early experimentation with wireless to others. He was convinced that using Hertzian waves, he could send telegraph signals without wires, far enough for such a system to have commercial value. And he established communications across the English Channel in 1899. He also had done previous work in Ireland and on the Salisbury Plain. So he did have some experience in making the darn thing work. While record-keeping and frequency management were in their infancy in the early 1900s, we really believe that his earliest transmissions occurred somewhere in the low RF spectrum, in what we would now call medium wave, and that they required extremely large antennas. Because his interest was mainly commercial, Marconi actually decided to open the Marconi Corporation at the early age of 23. And to do that, he wrote what was essentially a business plan that included the use of wireless telegraphy across the oceans, and his primary customers would in that case be shipping companies. This required some very large antennas, as one would expect, and his first station on the European side of the Atlantic was established at Poldhu in Cornwall in the United Kingdom. He really planned to erect two stations at approximately 4,000 kilometers distance for two-way radio communications, and he leased the land overlooking Poldhu Inlet in southwest Cornwall, and as his receiving site, his first choice was the northern end of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, at the town of South Wellfleet. He was determined to attempt transatlantic communications. That would be the golden ticket, as he would see it, for commercial success. The required antenna size, however, and so the transmitting frequencies, at best could only be projected by extrapolating from the values that he had already successfully reached in the earlier experiments in the late 1890s. And as you would expect, the first transmitter sites required very large antennas, and two identical antennas, one at each of the sites, consisted of 20 masts, each of which was over 60 meters in height and arranged in a circular distance with a diameter of about 400 feet. These rings of masts, as it were, supported conical antenna systems, and each insulated at the top and connected at the bottom, therefore forming an inverted cone. It sounds like the IDC vertical on steroids. Each mast was stayed to the next one, and the ground radials developed out from the center of the system. But just before testing it, a catastrophe struck. The Poldhu antenna collapsed in a storm on the 17th of September of 1901, and the South Wellfleet station collapsed in November of 1901. One might have expected that the insurance companies, such as they were in those days, might have been interested in these amazing coincidences. But no matter, he was nothing if not consistent, and he quickly had some new masts established and put up new antennas at both of these locations. These were set up pretty much in a fan shape in what we now call a Sturber curtain, and they were insulated at the top and collected at the lower end. Now, one of the other things which Marconi began to realize was that he needed both high antennas and very strong signals if he were going to make things work. And so he did. Design of the transmitter at Poldhu, another word about the antenna collapse. Each of the masts was 60 meters in length, which in old money really equates to about 190 feet. Now, masts of that size were not found lying around on the roadside or even at the most well-equipped Royal Navy dockyard. And so they were spliced together, 3 smaller masts, and it was at the splice point that both antenna farms suffered major casualties in a short period of time. This so discouraged the chief mechanical engineer, a Royal Navy commander by the name of Vivian, that he resigned from the Marconi Corporation, having the distinction of being the first employee or the first engineer recruited and the first one to leave. Before going into the innards of the transmitter at Poldhu, and an interesting story that is indeed, it's useful to see how closely we can determine the resonant frequency of the antenna. According to the Minimac software program, which is readily available, the resonant frequency of the antenna system was about 850 kilohertz. Now, there are several engineers over the years that have considered that the antenna, it may have been overcoupled, resulting in a double-humped frequency to amplitude response. But the thing that we do know is that Poldhu turned the primary oscillatory circuit by varying the discharge capacitor to maximize the antenna current. So it does seem logical to conclude that the overall system response would have been a single peak, centered on the resonant frequency of the antenna system itself, as measured by the software program, which is about 820 kilohertz. For those of you in the United States who like to do medium wave DXing, that's about the same. That is the same frequency that WBAP in Fort Worth, Texas operates on in the clear channel hours of the evening. So our model indicates that the antenna was inductive for all frequencies greater than the fundamental resonant frequency, a response of the antenna. So we conclude that the pole-due spark transmitter radiated effectively really only on the fundamental oscillation frequency of the tuned antenna system, or 820 kilohertz. Good thing that Fort Worth wasn't on the air at that time. And now to the transmitter itself. The pole-due transmitter was a two-stage circuit in which a first stage spark at some attainable lower voltage provided the energy for the second stage in tandem to spark at an extremely high voltage. Marconi really realized that to achieve high power from a spark transmitter, it was necessary to charge the condenser in excess of 1500 kilovolts. Now, with voltages of 1500 kilovolts at the key, recruiting operators must have proven somewhat difficult. It would only take one slipped finger to mean the early end of a promising career, one would think. The power capacity of the AC generators, which were in a separate portion of the compound, which were running 25 amperes at 1500 volts, in 1901 was quite insufficient to charge the condenser every period. Indeed, several periods of the supply generator, which was operating at 36 hertz, by the way, were required to bring the condenser voltage to gap breakdown potential. And when you look at it, it's probably ironic that the low spark rate was compromised Marconi himself, because when he was in Newfoundland, he used a regular telephone receiver of the old candlestick telephone type, which he placed to his ear to hear the dot, dot, dot transmission of the Morse letter S coming across from pole-due. At that low spark rate, all he'd really be able to hear was a click, which really would be very hard to distinguish from the atmospheric noise. The neighbors were not happy, as you might understand. Contemporary reports indicating that when running at its average output, the station was easily audible to villagers by ear, nearly 5 kilometers distance, and that the tin miners on the Lizard Peninsula refused to go below ground for fear that the sonic vibrations would cause rockfalls and even tunnel collapse. This may have been the first reported instance of TVI, which is something which has plagued amateur radio operators from that day to this. And now a word or two about receiver technology available to Marconi in 1901. Receiving wireless signals at that time was essentially a hit-and-miss proposition, mostly because of three factors. In those days, the receivers were not tuned, or if tunable, the selectivity was very, very poor. This was the case with the receivers we'll discuss later on. There was no means to amplify the signal. Lee DeForest and the development of amplification tubes were still several years in the future. And most importantly, in the context we're discussing, a sensitive detector system had yet to be invented. These early experimenters used a device called a coherer, which normally existed a very high resistance, but when subject to a voltage above a particular threshold level, exhibited decreased resistance. The filings coherer was essentially an on-off device. It needed an electrical voltage to make one transition, and, unbelievably, a physical shock called a tapper, to return it to its initial state. The sensitivity of the device was quite poor, and the actions of the receiver depended upon a voltage increase, which was independent of the energy of the signal, and most critically, and this is a very important point, it did not discriminate between signals and atmospherics very well at all. Marconi carried 2 types of receivers with him to Newfoundland and 3 types of coherers. One was a tuned receiver, but it tuned only to the estimated frequency of the transmitter, which, as we know now, was between 820 and 850 kilohertz. A second receiver was untuned, essentially a broadband noise receiver, and at the time he carried 3 different types of coherers, one containing loose carbon filings, another designed by Marconi himself, which consisted of a mixture of carbon dust and cobalt dust, and finally an Italian Navy coherer, which was considered the best available at the time, which consisted of a globule of mercury between a carbon plug and a movable iron plug. In later years, by the way, he devised a form of current-operated receiver called a magnetic detector, which really greatly enhanced his receiver sensibilities. But that was still long in the future. We come now at long last to the story of Marconi at Signal Hill. I'll try to be brief. Following the dual antenna setbacks, he decided to set up the receiving equipment in Newfoundland, which is conveniently some 500 kilometers closer to the transmitter at Poldhu, and he carried with him a small stack of kites and balloons designed to keep a single wire antenna, a long wire, aloft in stormy weather. Incidentally, when he arrived in Newfoundland, he found that the stock of hydrogen and helium, which he could use to inflate the balloons, was quite small, and was forced to use the kite rather than the balloons. But the site was chosen on Signal Hill, and the receiver was installed at the Cabot Tower there. For those of you that have been to the Cabot Tower, it is now a well-maintained museum, maintained by Parks Canada. But in those days, it was simply a disused military hospital for infectious patients, by the way, and he cabled Poldhu, directing the Marconi letter S be transmitted continuously on the following days from 3 to 7 p.m. local time. On the morning of the 12th of December, the wind carried away a kite that he had launched, carrying a 155-foot long wire antenna. Incidentally, before the assumption of the AWG coding system for wires, it's difficult to determine exactly the wire size he used, but the fact that it broke off the kite in the wind gives us an indication it was rather small, and artifacts contained at the museum now indicate it was somewhere between an AWG-12 and AWG-14 diameter wire. But a backup kite was launched with another wire attached, but it weaved uncontrollably, making it difficult for Marconi to adjust his new tunable receiver using the Italian Navy coherer. Whatever, because of this, and increasingly desperate, Marconi decided to use his older untuned receiver. On the fateful afternoon of the 12th of December, 1901, signals from the high-powered transmitter at Poldhu were reported to have been heard by Marconi and assistant George Kemp. At Signal Hill, over a distance of 3,500 kilometers, local worthies, including the Faculty of Engineering and Sciences at the university, later the Memorial University of Newfoundland, felt that in his zeal he had misled himself and misled the world into believing that the atmospheric noise crackling was in fact the letter S. Despite the crude equipment available to Marconi, and in considering the grave suspicions of the contemporary engineers and scientists, Marconi and his assistant George Kemp, who was in his employ, continued to assert that they did in fact hear 3 clicks, more or less buried in the static, and it's important to realize that only clicks would be heard, if at all, because of the very low spark rate of the transmitter and the quality of the telephone headset that he was using to record. None of the signals were recorded on tape or in any other kind of recording device, and Marconi recorded in his engineering notebook signals at 12:30, 1:10, and 2:20 local time. This recording in the notebook is the only proof that's existent today that a signal was in fact received, and the notebook is now in the custody of the Marconi Corporation in the UK. A little later on, in February of 1902, when Marconi was returning to England on the SS Philadelphia, shout out to my hometown there, using a tuned shipboard antenna, he received signals using his filings coherer from Poldhu up to a distance of 1,100 kilometers by day and 2,500 kilometers by night. And to give Signor Marconi his due, even those distances are rather remarkable, considering the receiving apparatus he used. And finally, his initial station at Cape Glace Bay on Cape Breton in December of 1902 was a massive structure composing 400 wires suspended from wooden towers, with down leads brought together in an inverted cone at the point of entry into the building. We believe the frequency was somewhere at 182 kilohertz, well down in the low frequency range. In 1905, his antenna at Glace Bay was a capacitive top-loaded structure with 20 horizontal radial wires, each at 300 meters long at a height of about 55 meters, and he was operating even lower at approximately 82 kilohertz. Signal reception was confirmed by a number of disinterested witnesses, and in my belief was probably the first true transatlantic wireless transmission. Budding young engineers, as of the type I taught for some 20-odd years in Ohio, often ended a lecture by saying, "What are the takeaways?" So here are the takeaways from the material we've been discussing the last 20 minutes or so. If, in fact, 850 kilohertz was the frequency used, and the test happened at the times noted, and the even minutes in the record suggest either a remarkable coincidence or remarkably loose timekeeping, take your pick, and secondly, with the entire path in daylight, notice the times were local times in Newfoundland, which is 3.5 hours behind the times in the UK, at a time when a sky wave would be heavily attenuated by the D layer on a winter day, and at the extreme bottom of the sunspot cycle 13, very similar to where we are today with the current sunspot cycle, at the very tail end of it, and with no magnetic storms at the time as recorded by any of the heliocentric observatories in North America or Europe, or for that matter for 10 days before or afterwards, with an antenna, a simple wind-blown long wire antenna which did have a tendency to break, as we recorded earlier, coupled to an untuned receiver, a broadband receiver without any amplification at all, using a borrowed telephone earpiece of the candlestick telephone type, and using a very rudimentary detector whose properties remain unknown throughout the ages. Unfortunately, it is less likely that we can give credence to Marconi's report that he heard signals at that time on Signal Hill. But there's another thought. And spending years in a Navy radio room, oftentimes for 4 or 6 hour watches, copying CW in a set of headphones, very frequently when I got up and left the Radio Shack and went to the berthing spaces to get some sleep, I would continue in my mind, in my ear, to hear repeated CW signals. Now, they didn't make any sense because I was just hearing sounds, which I later heard were called sometimes auditory hallucinations. Consider that Marconi was sitting on most uncomfortable conditions, freezing cold atop Signal Hill, at the entrance to the narrows of the harbor of St. John's, above the area known as the Outer Battery, and he was holding a telephone receiver to his ear during this time, listening to constant static for a 5-hour period. It is possible, and indeed I think likely, that he experienced auditory hallucinations. That's the story of Marconi on Signal Hill, and I do thank you very much for listening. So with that, this is Jack, KW5A, Kilowatt Whiskey 5 Alpha,